Then I witnessed in heaven an event of great significance. I saw a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon beneath her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant, and she cried out because of her labor pains and the agony of giving birth. Now, who is this woman? A metaphorical picture of a woman would instantly suggest the church, were it not for the fact that the church has faded from view by now, and more importantly, were it not for the fact that the Bible itself provides the translation. In Genesis 37:9, Joseph had a dream, and again he told his brothers about it. "Listen, I have had another dream," he said. "The sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed low before me." If you read the full story of Joseph, that is Jacob's son, you'll discover that each of the 11 stars represents one of his brothers. They would each bow down before him when he became the prime minister of Egypt, and each one of those brothers would then go on to become the father of a tribe of Israel, or Jacob. The 12th, of course, is Joseph himself. Therefore, this woman is not a personification of the church, it's a personification of God's other covenant people, Israel. I would narrow it down a little further and say that this is a personification of believing Israel. I would suggest that this is the 144,000 composed of 12,000 from each tribe, plus perhaps those who have responded to their evangelism and accepted Jesus as their Lord and Saviour during the trumpets. Israel is giving birth to something here, but is in tremendous distress as she goes through the birth pains. Remember how often the metaphor of birth pains was used before. Jesus had said in the Olivet Discourse that the Great Tribulation was just the beginning of the birth pains. Jeremiah had prophesied about this time of trouble, saying, "I hear cries of fear, there is terror and no peace." Now let me ask you a question. Do men give birth to babies? Then why do they stand there ashen-faced, hands pressed against their sides, like a woman in labour? In all history there has never been such a time of terror. It will be a time of trouble for my people Israel. Yet in the end they will be saved. Paul had spoken about the birth pains of the end times too in 1 Thessalonians 5:3. It seems that this is the birth that all those birth pains were leading up to, and whatever is being birthed, Satan clearly doesn't like it. Then I witnessed in heaven another significant event. I saw a large red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, with 7 crowns on his heads. His tail swept away 1/3 of the stars in the sky, and he threw them to the earth. He stood in front of the woman as she was about to give birth, ready to devour her baby as soon as it was born. The dragon here is Satan, and indeed this is the first mention of him in Revelation. When it says that he swept away 1/3 of the stars in the sky and threw them to earth, that's a reference to the fact that he caused 1/3 of the angels in heaven to fall, that is, rebel with him. Satan stands ready to devour this baby as soon as it's born. She gave birth to a son who was to rule all nations with an iron rod, and her child was snatched away from the dragon and was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where God had prepared a place to care for her for 1,260 days. Who is this son that Israel is giving birth to? Well, the main clue is that he is the son who is to rule all nations with an iron rod. This instantly puts us in mind of Jesus. Jesus is the one who will rule the nations with an iron rod after his second coming. In Revelation 19:15 it says, "From his mouth came a sharp sword to strike down the nations. He will rule them with an iron rod." However, Jesus also tells us that those who overcome the devil will rule alongside with him. He says, "To all who are victorious, who obey me to the very end, to them I will give authority over all the nations. They will rule the nations with an iron rod and smash them like clay pots." So Jesus will rule, but the believers will rule too. The groom and bride will reign together. The birth metaphor appears to represent Jesus' triumphant second coming with his bride. He will return to Israel and we along with him. That's what is being birthed here, and that's what the birth pains are all leading up to. Before we continue, we have to clear up a common misconception about this passage, one that is particularly perpetuated by the Catholic Church. The woman here does not represent Mary. The Catholic Church grasps at the idea that Mary is making a reappearance here in a bid to justify their inordinate obsession with a person who is otherwise only mentioned a handful of times in the New Testament and not mentioned at all after the first chapter of Acts. Many claim that this passage refers to Mary giving birth to Christ in Bethlehem. Therefore, Catholic art often portrays Mary as having a circle of 12 stars above her head and the moon beneath her feet. But this whole theory makes no contextual sense. Why would Revelation suddenly stop its chronological sequence of end-time prophecy and return thousands of years to tell the historical nativity story? There would be no reason to bounce back to an event that's already happened without any kind of warning within the text. The child doesn't fit with Jesus' first coming either. Revelation says that the child is snatched up to God's throne straight away, but we know that Jesus lived on the earth for around 33 years. Also, if it's Jesus' first coming, why is there no reference to his ministry, death, or resurrection? For these reasons, we can rule out the idea that it's a reference to the first coming. It's a reference to the second coming. What's being described here is an event which is happening chronologically around the time of the 6th and 7th trumpet, and more specifically during the key 1260 days. This is Jacob's trouble told from a heavenly perspective, hence the use of vivid imagery. On earth it will seem like abject turmoil, but these are all actually the birth pains that must be endured for the reappearance of the Saviour and the start of his millennial reign. Although painful, it's actually leading to something really good. Revelation confirms that during this time when the Antichrist arrives and his armies surround Jerusalem, Israel will flee from the city into the wilderness. And the woman fled into the wilderness where God had prepared a place to care for her for 1260 days. And it's that evacuation from Jerusalem that we're going to examine next.